speaking in good faith today with Sara Jolena Wolcott. Sara, thank you so much for connecting with us.
My pleasure.
Sara founded her company Sequoia Samanvaya to champion the concepts of remembering and re-enchanting our world, which we'll be talking about. And that's centered around rediscovering the spiritual connection to the earth she feels our society has lost. Sara was born into a Quaker family, an identity she still holds, but she works with all varieties of different religions and faiths around the world and has a wildly diverse and just plain wild resume, including degrees from Union Theological Seminary, the Institute of Developmental Studies at the University of Sussex, Haverford College, and the McKinnon Institute of Massage Therapy, and experience as a consultant for the World Bank, as a traveling singer in India, and as a correctional chaplain at Rikers Island Correctional Facility in New York City. Sara, would I be right in saying you're not afraid to try new things?
That's true. That's true.
Well, take me back to Quaker beginnings, where and how that set your course.
So I grew up in a small house on the edge of a great big hill, which was on the edge of a great valley in what we now refer to as California, in the East Bay Area. And, you know, it was one of those homes that you could open the back gate and you go out into land that my parents had helped to keep from development. So it became a local parkland. And I would often go out and wander around in the hills. And the area was used for to keep horses and cows. And my parents and I would often take walks there in the evening when the moon was high, or as moon was rising and the sun was setting. And we would look across the bay at the twinkling lights of San Francisco. And I always had a very strong sense of home and belonging. And those were the places that my father and my mother as well, both of them talked to me and told me stories about God and invited me to, both explicitly and implicitly, shared with me their love of the divine in the natural world. And I now can say that many people, I think, have very mystical experiences of God when they're young kids in nature. It's a pretty common story. And I certainly had my first kind of profound spiritual experience when I was like probably 6 or 7, and it was in those hills, lying on the ground and looking up at the moon. And I just felt such a deep presence of the Holy Spirit all around me. And I kind of made that very authentic in a way that sometimes I think that authentic desire that children have, can be so pure, you know, and that pure desire to be of service, to be close to know and to belong to the divine, to the Great Spirit. And that point for me, I just sort of had I didn't really, the name was less important. It was like a feeling, a feeling of devotion. And so and then my family was Quaker. I come from a long Quaker family. And so those connections were nurtured in the context of my Quaker faith, of my family. And we would go to meeting, and that immediate area where Quakers, we talk about meeting for worship. And so instead of a church, we have a meeting. And there's a long history. We can talk about that. But we gather, so we had what we call like a home meeting that we went to. In this case, that was literally meeting in somebody's home. And there was like 7 or 8 people who would gather together on Sunday morning. And then I actually pushed my parents to go when I was like 12 or something, to go to a bigger meeting, which had 150 people in it when I was my adolescence, because I wanted to, be part of a bigger community.
I'm tying together 2 images here. One is the beautiful image of you as a child lying back on the earth, looking up at the sky and sensing this support or connection.
Mm-hmm.
And that's nature. But then with people to go to Quaker meeting, and
Mm-hmm.
if if this has been done as the ones I've attended, often they're sitting in silence until
Mm-hmm.
someone is moved upon by the
Mm-hmm.
Spirit. Did you feel that same sort of connection in those meetings as you did in the canyon?
Oh, it's such a beautiful question. I did, and I think I was very fortunate that I did. I don't know if everyone does. When they go to whatever their family's religious community is, they may not feel that same connection. I did, and I could actually I remember probably at a similar age, definitely before I was 10, um, sitting with the adults in the meeting, and sometimes the kids would not join the adults, but on this occasion I did join the adults. And there was one of those oriental carpets on the rug, on the floor, and it was just so happened that literally every person's feet was on a different flower in the carpet.
Uh-huh.
And it was like this profound moment for me, and I was just in the depth of the silence and the holiness of the Spirit. And I gave my first ministry, and it was about oh, we're all the Spirit of God is like these intertwining ropes of the carpet that are connecting all the flowers, and we are the flowers, and the Spirit is the vine that's connecting us. And I didn't even have now I have some biblical imagery around that, but at that point it was really just taking what was literally in front of me with that carpet. And that was, I think, a moment when I really connected my internal experience with this social community,
Mm.
with the
And
divine.
I'm sure some of the adults there were thinking, out of the mouth of babes, because they had sat with their feet on that carpet many, many times
Many,
without
many
having.
times. Children often offer profound ministry,
Yeah.
profound ministry. And I think they often see the things that adults, we're just so used to it. And it's right there. It's right in front of us.
When did the connection you felt with the earth start to turn into what appears to me to be this lifetime commitment?
Mm, mm, mm. I think so it was always there. Um, in high school, I was very concerned about climate change, as were many of my peers, and my family had a strong environmental, kind of, uh, both my parents were local environmental activists. Um, so it was always there. It was always present. Um, and so I was kind of I wanted to address climate change. And so I got into it from different perspectives. I was trying to address it from activism, and then I was moving into policy and working with technology and having new technological innovations and having new different kinds of policy. And it didn't take that long before I realized that most of the conversations were dominated by people who were not bearing the brunt of the problems. The people who were trying to solve the problem were not the ones who were experiencing the problem firsthand. And that has racial and class dimensions in our society. And two, that it was just kind of became clear that this was a problem of worldview and mindset, and that climate change was also not just a technological or policy crisis, but a spiritual crisis. And that led me down this sort of really kind of set of rabbit holes. And then when I was working, so I was aware of that. And then I also had a call to ministry. And those two things were kind of happening at the same time, right? I sort of was I was reshaping how I understood ecological challenges in our society at the same time that I was having my own sort of call to ministry grow. And for those of you who know much about Quakers, you know that Quakers don't have a professional ministry,
Right.
especially unprogrammed Friends, which I grew up in. And so I did a lot of service for the Society of Friends as a young person, and it was very fulfilling. But there wasn't a clear pathway for me as someone who felt a very clear call to ministry. And so for a long time, those things were kind of in tension. And then it kind of, when I was working in India, so this is, skip forward several years. So there's quite a number of years when I was doing this sort of professional international development, sustainable development work. And I had this call to ministry, and I was trying to do as much volunteer work or volunteer ministry for the Quaker communities as I could. And I saw the connections between my professional world and my kind of volunteer world for a while. But I wasn't seeing how to connect them. And then when I was in India, a whole bunch of different things happened. And one of them was that I became a singer. I realized that what it meant for climate change to be a spiritual problem, a spiritual challenge, was that we had to engage in the question of what is it that sustains us. And the answer to that question could be found in music and art and dance and culture and tradition and ritual and spiritual community. And those things were all connected to each other. And then that for me was kind of like my aha moment.
I would just have to maybe interject and say a lot of people would say, no, it's about technological innovation and turning down our taps.
That's what I used to think of too.
So interesting to have this open up to you. Now, this turned into something that if people go to your website, which is sarajolena.com, it's SARAJOLENA.com, mm-hmm. You've really codified some of these concepts in very interesting and memorable ways. And I wonder if you would explain what it means to you, these concepts of remembering, which we have R-E and then capital M for membering, and re-enchanting.
Thank you for that question. So I went to Union Theological Seminary. I went to divinity school after India, and whilst there, I started engaging in. I was talking with indigenous people here on this continent who traced the histories of climate change to colonization. And in all of my studies, no one had really traced the histories of climate change to colonization or to the doctrine of discovery. It made no sense to me. So I did a lot of historical and theological history, church history work to better understand what they meant by that and to understand how climate change is connected to the histories of colonization. And then in the process of doing that, when I was engaging with really some terrible histories, like very violent histories of the church, and doing so in seminary, right, in a very Christian context, and doing deep biblical exegesis at the same time. And I really, I kept on having these, it was somatic, it was emotional. The process of thinking about where we came from was not simply a verbal narration. It was an embodied experience, and it was spiritual. Like I was reconstituting how I understood the Bible and how I understood God through engaging with these histories differently. And it felt like which was completely unexpected to me, that because I wanted to, in part, because I was trying to have my relationship with God be the primary thing in my intellectual research, I had to engage with research differently. I had to engage with the historical questions I was asking differently. I had to have a level of my how I was embodying how I understood the divine, how I understood myself, needed to change. And I started referring to that process not just as re-narrating, but as remembering. And I started teaching and I realized that remembering, which in some ways I think it's one of the most common across the different faith traditions, command is a command to remember. Right. You drink this wine, you eat this bread in remembrance of me. As Jesus says, and which is for many the communion ritual in many different Christian traditions. And, in Islam, you have something very similar. You pray 5 times a day because because Allah knows that the human being is so fragile and forgetful. You pray 5 times a day to remember God, to remember that you are loved, to remember that you are held, right? And so much of the Jewish prayer is a prayer of remembrance, and some of the main rituals are rituals of remembrance. So so I began working with this understanding of remembrance and remembering as a somatic experience, and that we need to engage both with remembering our deep connection to the Holy One, as well as, and that part of that is also remembering how we got disconnected and the multiple ways that disconnection have happened. And you kind of need to do both.
In the intro, we talked about that you help people rediscover the spiritual connection to the earth that you feel our society has lost. You just were referring to that. Is it possible to do that with secular organizations? Or do you always, it seems like you would have to bring in a spiritual connection. What kind of organizations would call on you to help them do better at what they do, or to reestablish and remember those connections?
So I think that this is I think reestablishing our connectivity to earth and to all of God's creation is an inherently spiritual process. That said, I have found that there are people who don't experience it as such. So I just want to say that there are those who don't experience that at all. And sometimes I think that's a question of linguistics. People have different names for their experience. And then sometimes I think it does seem that some people just don't have a felt embodied experience of the divine, which I still don't understand. It's not something I understand, but it's something I observe. But so I think that what it means to experience the divine love entails experiencing our connectivity to all beings and to all of creation. And what it means to experience our connectivity to all beings also entails experiencing God's love for us. And that
on the face of that sounds very, very Buddhist.
It is. It's also very Christian.
Yeah, but I think you were right that we have lost that idea in much of Christianity.
Yeah, much of Christianity, it's lost. It's there. It's all there. It doesn't take much to see it once you're looking for it. And so especially when I'm working with Christian and Catholic organizations or individuals, that often what's happening is we're kind of rereading scripture in order to see what's kind of right in front of us, right? And
Saint Francis knew this.
Saint Francis, it's in it's in the Genesis, right? God moves over the face of the waters and looks into the depth. And that, the waters are present at creation, right? The waters are bearing witness and active, and maybe even actively engaging with God in the act of creation. That they're there. There's a presence of the waters are present, and they deserve being mentioned in the first book of Genesis. It's an incredible thing. And so much of the creation story is not as much about humans as it is about the plants and the animals and the seeds. So within these core texts, and Jesus is constantly going into the wilderness and using agricultural imagery. And you could see Jesus as a man of his watershed. He doesn't he never goes beyond 12 miles. He stays in his watershed throughout his ministry and throughout his lifetime. And he's constantly going to the wilderness to talk to his Father.
I'm curious what it is. Maybe part of it was going to divinity school, maybe some going to India, but what helped you open, some people are afraid of this, to open their minds to the truths and the knowledge of other faith traditions. But you've been open to that, and especially open to, it seems, drawing from them their wisdom about the connection to the creation.
So Quakers as a whole tend to be very open to multiple traditions. It's it's pretty common that like within a Quaker meeting, you might have people who've spent a lot of time with Buddhism, spent a lot of time with Islam, or spent a lot of time with Wicca. Like it's pretty common that you'll have a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of experience, and have had profound spiritual connections in those other traditions before or even during their time with Quakers. So I grew up in a community that uplifted that capacity. And then, and I was like very, very, very Quaker, by which I had no interest in any other tradition. And then when I was in India, I had a couple of experiences that I think of it as like expanding my listening. So I could still hear Jesus, but I could hear other beings that were from like it's like a different sound. It felt like hearing notes I hadn't heard before, or hearing like music I hadn't heard before.
Interesting comparison. You speak a lot about ancestry and ancestors too on
Mm.
your website and in your work. Do you have a moment to tell me about that?
So what I find, our ancestors are so important, and this is something that I think the Church of Latter-day Saints there's a deep appreciation of that. Where do we come from? Who our ancestors are informs us. It doesn't determine who we are, but it informs us. And so when people are often working with particularly some of the more challenging histories of colonization, and they're looking at their own family, or looking at their own family's relationship to land and to water and to inheritance, and to how do they relate to the land differently. Like it doesn't take long before they start looking at how do their ancestors relate to land and water, and how do we want to relate to how our ancestors related to things. And so it's really common that individuals will talk to me about their family. And so I started, and for my own family and my own journey of retelling history, I started looking at my own family history differently. And I come from some of the founding fathers of the United States of America on my father's side, and understanding what they did and how they did it in a different key has really helped me understand the role, like how I can relate to land and water and to the divine in a different way. And so in part because I've done that with my own family history, I help other people. And so I talk about as ecological family history. How do we tell stories about where we come from that incorporate lands and waters, and the peoples of lands and waters, indigenous peoples, and people from different parts of the world? How do we incorporate a multiplicity of stories into our own story? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And you've got me thinking about not only people, but also places. You talk about the ecological situation. Throughout the Old Testament, for instance, you hear about, and we have been promised a land, or I return to the land of my fathers.
Yep.
There's this connection. We move around so much and so cavalierly that either we have to claim the whole earth as our land, which probably would be wise for us to think of it that way. But we don't switch ancestors.
Oh, that's
Our
true.
ancestors that's a permanent feature of the program.
And our
So
ancestors come from somewhere. They don't come from nowhere.
yes, and so they've passed on not only traditions, but even their biology has been shaped in some way as a reaction to or interaction with that place they came from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we carry the story of the land and the history of the land in our bodies, like everyone does. And it's in our food traditions. It's literally in our genes. And the water remembers us, and it's interesting, when people sometimes I support people in thinking about what does it mean to connect with their ancestral homeland. And for some people, when they return to the places their ancestors are from, they have this immediate recognition, and it's like they know the land. And for other people, they don't. So I just like that. And I find that to me, that's part of the mystery. Why is it that for some people they do and some people they don't? Or they connect, sometimes people connect with a land that's not where their ancestors are from. That also happens. I find how humans to connect to land to be part of the mystery of how God works. Like there's a little bit that I don't think I will ever fully understand. But I think there's a poetic beauty in like I think of it as, how do your bones connect to the stones of where you're from and of where you are now? And that as people connect to land, it's one of the things that can be most helpful and most healing is connecting with land and water. Figuring out how to do that well in a society where connectivity to land often looks like property ownership can be really difficult.
Yeah. We may cut this, but just as an aside, I'm one of those people who've had the experience of going someplace I'd never been before and realizing this is the first place I've been to that feels like my home. This is my place. Unfortunately, I don't live there, but I do try to return to it now and then.
Where is it? I'm curious.
It's in the kind of the middle of the Oregon coast. Certain areas there. And I have no idea why, but even if I go there for 2 days, I could just sit and almost do nothing and just kind of meditate on the fact that I feel like I'm home.
Yeah.
No idea why that is.
It's, I think the spirit of the divine, the spirit of God, which is in earth, calls us to different places.
I've also, as I've considered it, again, we may cut all this. This is just me because I get the cool chance to talk to you. I've wondered if it's because it's a border place. It's between land and water. It's a little of both and not completely either. I'm on the LGBT spectrum, if you call it that, somewhere, and someone who's always looking for their placement finds that my life is always in between one side or the other. I've wondered if that's something about being in that foggy space.
That liminal space, yeah.
Yeah, I have no idea, but that's occurred to me. Let me
what I know is that, like, for when people have that experience, right? When people have the experience of having land or water that really calls to them, the value of honoring that and of going there, visiting it, moving there, it means different things for different people. And letting that landscape speak to the external landscape, speak to your internal landscape.
Ooh, I like that. External landscape. That's great. How has your experience, well, let me try and read my own writing here. You experience, since a very young age, a connection with God. How has that changed or deepened or maybe for a while been elusive in the course of your life? What has that journey been like?
I sometimes think of it as like a door that's always open. It's not, so sometimes I might be further from the door, but it's always open. It's never closed. It's always there. And I think, sometimes when my life has been difficult, sometimes that sense of the divine is like the thing that kind of keeps me going or keeps me, when I've been in traveling overseas or feeling very alone, very separate from my family or very separate from my own lands, the lands that I feel connection to, and my friends, like that connection to God has been that which carries me and comforts me, as well as that which spurs me on, like pushes me a little bit. So I've always felt it. I think there have been times when, like these days, I think let's see here, like my access points have changed. So like what the prayers that I have said have shifted over time, or the songs have shifted, or the way in which the places where that's easy for me to find it. So there was a while when I had a hard time feeling God in a church building. I kind of just didn't feel God in church buildings. I felt God in the wilderness, or I felt God like in Quaker meetings, but not if I went into a church building, I didn't feel it. And then I was working in a church. And I was actually at the front of the church one time, and I was giving a sermon, and I was just sitting and I was waiting for everyone to come into that church building, and it was just, there was the lighting. The lighting was such that as people opened the door of the church and each person came in, the church was a bit darker than the outside, right? It was like a bright morning. And it looked like every person was just surrounded with light. They were backlit. So some of this, but because of like where I was sitting in the church, it looked like every person coming into that building was just surrounded by this glorious light. And I was so moved. I was like, oh, this must be how maybe this is how God feels when God looks at us, right? That God sees us surrounded by this, like just light coming out of us. And we, like in the bright light of day, don't always see that, but it's actually always there. And that was one of several moments that actually led me to experience the divine in churches. And then now I can experience God in church. And I'm very grateful for that, because there's a lot of people who look for God in church. So I'm glad I can experience God there also. But I'm also just grateful to have that like glimpse into how beautiful God sees us,
That's a beautiful image. And maybe we need more churches that open directly to the outside and not through foyers and hallways.
Right. I think I had, like, before I hadn't, a lot of times you don't go right out, right? You go in like the building, or the nave opens into something else. But you can have it in many, many places. So for like, I think in some ways some people go from church outside. I've gone from outside in.
You do something really interesting when people are thinking of working with you or having a group that work with you. You say one of the things you say is, it's worth knowing about me before you decide if I'm the right fit to work with you. I'm not here for you. I'm here for the spirit within you. Your calling to come forth and serve those whom you are here to serve. Mm-hmm. Comment on that.
So for almost any spiritual support, and I do a lot of my work is spiritual direction, right? I'm kind of working one-on-one with people. And I also do marriages and baptisms and all sorts of, I do ceremonial work, and I do the teaching and working directly with organizations. So I think for any, whether this is true for any, a consultant or a coach or a spiritual director or a pastor, I think a huge question or a therapist even, is actually like, are you aligned with that person? Like, is that like even more than the method that person uses? Because the magic, the juice of is in the transmission between you and that person. And then they've done some studies in psychotherapy and other places. It's like, it has, which method of psychotherapy or therapy is best has a lot to do with the connection between the two people more than the method itself. So some methods, I think some people are more geared towards somatic methods, and some people are more geared towards like study or whatever. There's lots of different methods. So I think that in general, like because it's a connection. It's like, how can God be experienced between those two people? Because God's the one doing the work. We're just like little people, right? We have ego, we have grief, we have our ideas of what's right and wrong. And God's much bigger than that. And so it's like, we're all like, all of us who are trying to help each other, even if you're not in an official role of church leadership, you're still in the role of being part of the family of God. And so in that role is like, how can you be like, how much can you like release some of that channel? And so that you can like let it flow. So that's I think part of where that's coming from. And then I think part of it's like, really, like, I'm not super interested in people who want to use spiritual stuff to grow their ego. Oh. Right? Or to become like, yes, I mean, obviously, like, financial well-being is important, but I'm not a prosperity gospel person. I'm not in, it's like, I don't like, yes, God can help us with multiple forms of resources. But like the spiritual questions are questions that face all of us in all parts of our lives. So it's like, if you, that which is within you, if that spirit, if that ministry that is calling you is one that you want to pay attention to, then working with people who can listen to that part of you, who can listen to that and help midwife it and help grow it and help bring it out, so that that seed of the divine love can spread throughout your entire being and inform all of your life. Like, that doesn't mean that things are easy. It means that you're not alone. And it means that there's a deeper purpose and meaning. And that's what I find interesting, right? That's, to me, like, that deeper, bigger, like, not just about the surface level of who you think you are, but of what is calling and moving within you, and how that connects to all beings, and how that connects to where Earth herself is moving, and how that connects to your leading. And that's true. I say your, and I refer to that as an individual, but it can also be true for couples. It can be true for families. It can be true for organizations. Because within each of these bigger social structures, like, there is like, spirit can hold it. There is like a heartbeat, and to listen to that heartbeat. In addition to the Sara Jolena site, I also have the Sequoia Samanvaya site, which has more about the courses that I teach. And they link to each other. The Sara Jolena site is a little bit more like the kind of one-to-one work and the ceremonial work.
We can put those links in our show notes on the webpage for the episode as well.
Cool. So there's something that I wanted to share when we were talking about how Christianity sometimes forgets its own ecological rooting, and how you were talking about some of the Buddhist stuff. So when I talk about re-enchanting, so to kind of like, what, and this isn't so much a question so much as it's like an insight that I want to give people, is that when the Bible was translated from the Aramaic and into Greek and into English, there was a word, logos, was translated to refer to God. God was, and this in John, right? In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. Like, this is a scripture piece that's so important to so many pastors and to just so many people of faith, right? And one of the things that I've learned, and I learned this through a friend of mine who wrote a sweet little book called Church of the Wild. But one of the things that she talks about, and that I have since...
By the way, she's been a guest, and we have...
Oh, Victoria Lors. Oh, awesome.
She was wonderful.
Did she talk about logos?
No.
Okay. Then I will say this on her behalf. Well, not on her behalf, because it's been a big one for me. Is that there is a translation in which it could have been translated, instead of logos, it could have been translated into sermo. And sermo actually means conversation. And so if you read it as, in the beginning there was the conversation, then you start getting much closer to something that we think of as interbeing, which we think of as a Buddhist thing. But you start thinking, oh, like the sermo it's about the interbeingness and the interdialogue that God is having perhaps within God's self, and certainly with all of creation. And so it's like this, this is a piece that I keep bringing to people in spiritual direction work as you're going through your spiritual path. Like you're listening both for direction and for conversation. And how much does it change our perception of the divine if we think that God is in the multiplicity of the conversation as well as a singular word?
Thank you. Yeah, that's beautiful to contemplate. Sara Jolena Wolcott, thank you for speaking with me today in good faith.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you, Steve.